This is the Seasonic Focus SGX 650 power supply, a model that is the smaller equivalent of the, well, basically the entire Seasonic Focus series. A power supply series that has met a good welcome into the market, and that's mainly thanks to the performance of these units alongside a 10-year warranty and a very good build quality. The Seasonic Focus SGX 650 is an SFX L type power supply, which makes it slightly larger than the usual SFX power supply. And why is that, you say? Simple. You see, with a regular SFX power supply, it would be impossible to install a 120mm fan. However, with an SFX L form factor, you can, and that's what the Focus SGX 650 uses for its active cooling. The Seasonic Focus SGX 650 Gold is available for purchase right now for around $130 or the equivalent in euros, and it is backed up by a 10-year warranty, which, knowing Seasonic, you'll never need it, and if you do need it, they'll honor it. In terms of how this power supply looks, well, it looks good, but that's it. There isn't much to say here, as there isn't much going on at all. The fan grill is made to be part of the entire casing of the power supply. Yes, it can be removed, but by doing that, you will essentially remove a side of the power supply casing. The sides of the power supply are simple and do resemble the design of the Focus power supply series, and if you'll ask me which power supply especially, all of them. There is also nice to see some additional ventilation grills present on the sides. This power supply is small and every bit helps with the cooling. As many other Focus series power supplies, the Focus SGX 650 has a modular design. This means that all cables, yes, including the motherboard 24-pin, are removable. The side that houses the connectors on this power supply has a lovely diagram that labels every single connector, and these are painted onto the metal surface, not just some paper label that can be easily damaged or removed. Speaking of the cables, all of them are flexible and all of them are the newer flat ribbon style cables. This is great because flat cables are much better to use when installing the power supply, mainly because you can overlap them and thus save a lot of time and a lot of space with the installation process. The exhaust side of the power supply is very simple. It has the usual perforations in the casing to allow for the air to be exhausted, while some Focus series power supplies have an additional button here for the hybrid fan control. This model unfortunately does not have that. Before we head into the internals of the power supply and testing it to see if it's worth something, we need to see what is being delivered with this unit. And we have a typical user manual, a power cable, a bracket to install the power supply inside an ATX case, 3 Velcro straps for cable management, 8 regular zip ties and around 8 regular Phillips screws for installing the power supply and the included bracket. It is also worth noting that this power supply is protected by high quality soft foam on both sides, a thing which should be the standard for every middle of the road and up power supply, but apparently it's not. Taking apart the power supply is very easy, as you just remove a few screws. However, I will not show you how I took this power supply apart. Why? First, because you have no business inside the power supply to begin with, especially one that has been powered on at some point. And second, because you will absolutely void your warranty doing so. Anyway, the fan used for the active cooling on the Focus SGX 650 is made by Globefan, fortunately, and it is the model S12 S120 1512 HP. This fan is a 120mm fan that is slim, and it basically has a width of just 15mm, which is why it fits in this tiny power supply. The fan uses a fluid bearing system and has a maximum speed of 2200 RPM, although these technical specifications might vary. As usual, this fan is connected to the power supply through a simple 2-pin connector, which makes this fan very easy to replace if somehow you need that. The platform used on the Focus SGX 650 is a modified Seasonic Focus platform. Obviously, the modifications were done to not only make everything fit inside an SFX power supply, but also to maintain the level of performance that is expected from not only Seasonic, but for a power supply found at this price range. The soldering quality is good for the most part, although thanks to the small size of this power supply I can't really check for everything on the PCB. The main capacitor of this power supply is made by Nikon Chemicon. However, I have seen this very power supply also use a Nichicon capacitor, so perhaps there are some variations in between revisions. This main capacitor is rated for around 105 degrees Celsius, which is typical for such a high-end power supply. The filtering starts at the back of the power supply, and here is the standard layout. There are 4 Y-type capacitors and 2 X-type capacitors, alongside a secondary PCB attached to the back of the unit. The polymer capacitors are made by Nippon Chemicon and Nichicon, which makes the statement that this power supply uses only Japan-made capacitors very true. The passive cooling is done by 2 large aluminum-made heatsinks. These make direct contact with the PCB of the power supply and with the MOSFETs of the unit. It is worth pointing out that the standby power controller used on this unit is an EM8569C, and you can spot it right underneath everything. Now that we know what makes this power supply work and how it gets its rated certification, it's time to see how it performs while being used. First, you must understand one thing. Power supply testing is not an easy process, mainly because there are many things to test and because it requires expensive and complex equipment. Until I have the required equipment to test the power supply extensively, we will make do with a high-end system and basic measurements with a multimeter on the cables and all the rails. It's not the best, but it gives us a general idea of what to expect from the tested power supply. And with a system that at its peak uses 500 watts of power, the Seasonic Focus SGX 650 reached an average efficiency of 91.4%, and that's with a 500 load, give or take. Usually a power supply is at its peak efficiency when the total load applied is around 80% of its capacity. All in all, 91.4% efficiency is great, especially for this tiny power supply. Also, before you ask, all testing is done at a steady room temperature of 26 degrees Celsius. This places the Seasonic Focus SGX 650 below the regular Focus GX 750 and many platinum-rated power supplies. Not bad at all. Measuring the voltage oscillation is done by connecting a multimeter to one of the main cables of the power supply. Afterwards, each rail is measured with the system at both idle and then running a synthetic benchmark to place the heavy load on the power supply. And in this test, the Focus SGX 650 is pretty much in the same place, right behind the regular Focus GX 750. What you must understand from this is that as long as the power supply does not have its voltage moving up and down and basically away from the rail, then it's doing its job. What you're looking at here is as close as possible to the 12, 5 and 3 volts specifications. In terms of the noise output under load, the Focus SGX 650 reached a maximum noise output of 36 decibels, with the measuring device placed at a distance of 10 centimeters away from the system and the power supply. Not bad at all, and if the system is not doing much, then the power supply noise output drops to pretty much nothing. The Focus SGX 650 is a good power supply that delivers the advertised performance. In terms of the efficiency, this power supply averaged, at least in my case, 91.4% at 500 watts of load. Not only that, but the noise output is not high at all, especially for a power supply of this size. Keep in mind that a small power supply needs a fan that spins faster to move the air around and over the internal components, while a regular size power supply can make do without such a high-speed fan as there is more room for ventilation inside, and those usually use a 135mm fan as well. The build quality is very good, both on the outside and especially on the inside. You also might have noticed how there is a lot of silicone inside the power supply. That is, so it prevents coil winding, which by the way this power supply does not have, not my sample at least. The performance is good, especially for one of the first SFX models released by Seasonic. Even though the power supply is using a modified Focus internal platform, this type of conversion was done with a minimal downgrade in performance. The Seasonic Focus SGX 650 is good and ticks all the right boxes, especially in regards to performance. However, you need to keep in mind that this power supply is not a standard SFX unit. It is slightly bigger, or at least longer, to accommodate for the bigger fan, so please do your homework and see if this power supply will fit in your small form factor case. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and if you want to support me in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the subscriber star pages of this channel.